Hot news on August 15, 2025, as President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin meet for a landmark summit in Anchorage, Alaska, at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. Summit overview and atmosphere. The summit, dubbed Alaska 2025, marks their first in-person encounter since Trump's re-election and the first ever held on U.S. soil since 1988. The location carries symbolic weight. Alaska was once Russian territory and lies outside the jurisdiction of the ICC, which has issued an arrest warrant for Putin. Military pageantry underscored U.S. strength, with F-22 fighter jets and a B-2 stealth bomber flying overhead, and Cold War-style displays such as a red carpet flanked by jets. Format and participants. Originally slated as a one-on-one summit, the meeting expanded to a three-on-three format. U.S. delegation, President Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Russian delegation, President Putin, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and Foreign Affairs Advisor Yuri Ushakov. A broader working lunch includes top U.S. figures like the Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary, Defense Secretary, and Trump's Chief of Staff. Key agenda and stakes. Central focus, negotiating a ceasefire in Ukraine and working toward a wider peace process. Trump has conveyed urgency. I want the killing to stop and I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. Discussions may include controversial ideas like territorial swaps or NATO non-expansion guarantees, raising alarms in Kyiv and among Western allies. Trump floated the possibility of a trilateral continuation with Ukrainian President Zelensky, while Zelensky himself warned against sidelining Ukraine and insisted any settlement must include Kyiv. Symbolism and criticism. The summit's staging evokes Cold War imagery, fighter jets, official limousines, ceremonial displays, creating a powerful visual backdrop. While Trump presents it as a peace initiative, critics argue that such talks are unlikely to curb Putin's ambitions in Ukraine and may legitimize his aggression. Bottom line, the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska marks a bold diplomatic moment on August 15, 2025, blending spectacle with geopolitics. It centers on ending the Ukraine conflict, but tensions simmer over potential concessions, the exclusion of Ukraine, and whether this summit can deliver real results, especially amid global skepticism and high-stakes symbolism. Why Alaska? Symbolic venue. Alaska's geographical proximity and historical ties to Russia made it a symbolically resonant location. Putin referenced shared World War II cooperation and the region's historical linkages, using the setting to project a tone of reconciliation. What did each leader aim to achieve? Putin's goals. 1. Break Western isolation. Putin hadn't visited a Western-hosted summit since launching the 2022 invasion of Ukraine and is also subject to an ICC arrest warrant. The warm U.S. reception, red carpet, flyovers, and honors served as a diplomatic win, elevating his global legitimacy. 2. Frame peace on his terms. He stressed that any peace must address root causes of the conflict, a common Russian framing suggesting security concerns and NATO expansion as provocations. Trump's goals. 1. Reassert diplomatic authority. This was the first U.S. Russia presidential meeting hosted on U.S. soil since 2007 and the first face-to-face encounter between the two since 2019. 2. Shift strategy from ceasefire to peace deal. Trump arrived hoping to secure a ceasefire in Ukraine, even warning of severe consequences if Moscow refused. However, afterward he dropped that demand in favor of pursuing a broader peace agreement. 3. Use summit as political theater. Trump portrayed the summit as extremely productive, although concrete results were absent. It appears to have been a platform for optics and messaging, outcome and interpretation. No agreement reached. The meeting ended after less than 3 hours, with no ceasefire or concrete deal on Ukraine. Shifted narrative. Trump moved from seeking a ceasefire to favoring a direct peace agreement, matching Putin's long-standing stance. Putin's PR win. He emerged as a gains without making concessions, bolstering his international image. U.S. and allies reacted with concern. European and Ukrainian leaders pushed back, emphasizing that any peace terms must include Ukraine's consent and cannot involve forced territorial concessions. Next steps lined up. A trilateral engagement in Washington involving Zelensky and European leaders is being planned, likely to counterbalance Alaska's unilateral tilt. In summary, the Alaska summit served multiple strategic purposes. For Putin, it was a diplomatic triumph signaling restoration of his global status without meaningful concession. For Trump, it was a high-profile attempt to reassert diplomatic initiative, though critics say it relinquished leverage and vindicated Moscow's agenda. Despite theatrical optics, the summit produced no tangible peace outcome and may ultimately shift pressure back onto Ukraine and its European allies. Putin's three main wins. 1. Legitimacy on the global stage. Simply appearing on U.S. soil, warmly welcomed with military honors, gave Putin a powerful diplomatic image boost after years of isolation due to the Ukraine war and his ICC arrest warrant. This legitimization was one of his clearest wins without offering real concessions. 2. Shift in U.S. demands. Trump went into the summit talking about a ceasefire in Ukraine, but afterward, he pivoted toward a broader peace agreement, aligning more with Moscow's framing that negotiations must address long-term security issues, not just battlefield pauses. That shift weakened Ukraine's leverage and echoed a Kremlin position. 3. No concessions given. Putin left Anchorage without making any binding promises on troop withdrawals, ceasefires, or security guarantees. He secured a narrative victory by positioning himself as reasonable and open to talks, while avoiding commitments. Why talks aren't over. Trump plans to bring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and European leaders to Washington for further discussions. The Alaska meeting was more of an opening gambit. It tested how far Trump was willing to go in meeting Putin halfway, and it set the stage for whether Ukraine and its allies can push back diplomatically. In short, Putin gained legitimacy, a favorable shift in U.S. rhetoric, and walked away without concessions. But the ultimate outcome depends on the follow-up talks in Washington, where Ukraine and Europe will try to reassert their influence. Would you like me to also summarize what Ukraine and European allies said in reaction to this Alaska outcome? The global headline. Summit puts Putin back on the global stage, and Trump echoes a Kremlin position captures the biggest takeaways from the Alaska meeting. Here's what it means in detail. 1. Putin back on the global stage. The Alaska summit was Putin's first U.S. visit in nearly 2 decades and his first Western-hosted summit since the Ukraine invasion in 2022. Despite being under an ICC arrest warrant and largely shunned in Europe, he was received in Anchorage with full honors, red carpet, U.S. military flyovers, and ceremonial treatment. This elevated his image as a legitimate global statesman, something the Kremlin badly wanted to showcase to both domestic and international audiences. 2. Trump echoes Kremlin position. Before the meeting, Trump emphasized a ceasefire in Ukraine as his top goal. Afterward, he dropped that line and instead talked about pursuing a broader peace deal, almost word for word how Moscow frames negotiations. This rhetoric shift aligned with Russia's long-standing narrative that peace talks should address NATO expansion, Ukraine's alliances, and broader European security architecture, not just troop withdrawals or frontline pauses. 3. The optics versus substance. No deal was reached. There was no ceasefire, no troop withdrawal, no security framework agreed. The optics, however, were enough to hand Putin a win. His presence in the U.S. was itself a statement, and Trump's softened language looked like diplomatic validation of Moscow's stance. Bottom line, the Anchorage summit wasn't about concrete outcomes. It was about symbolism and narrative control. Putin proved he could once again appear on the world stage as a peer to the U.S. president, while Trump's rhetorical shift made it look as if Washington was beginning to accept Russia's framing of the war. Reactions from European and global leaders. Reuters, world leaders' reactions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky endorsed a proposed trilateral meeting involving the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine, emphasizing the inclusion of Europe. European leaders collectively stressed the need for robust security guarantees, unwavering military cooperation, and firmly condemned Russian territorial ambitions. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer acknowledged Trump's diplomatic efforts, but reinforced the commitment to intensifying sanctions on Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron, along with Italy's Giorgia Meloni, Germany's Friedrich Merz, and EU officials maintained support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, underscoring that any peace process must involve Zelensky. Leaders from Nordic and Central Europe, e.g. Norway, Czech Republic, Poland, warned against Russian aggression and advocated for sustained Western unity. Hungary offered a more optimistic spin, seeing renewed U.S. Russia dialogue as a potential step toward global stability. Reuters, European leaders reaffirmed support for Ukraine. Key figures including Macron, Merz, Starmer, and top EU officials reaffirmed their commitment to supporting Ukraine and maintaining pressure on Russia. They insisted that any peace decisions must include Zelensky and proposed a well-supported trilateral meeting. The joint statement emphasized that borders cannot be altered by force, and that economic sanctions must remain until Ukraine achieves a fair and lasting peace. Politico, European concerns over sidelining Ukraine. European leaders worried that Trump's warm reception of Putin could marginalize Zelensky. Some coordinated to have Finland's President Alexander Stubb accompany Zelensky to Washington to ensure he wasn't overshadowed. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was also considered to join. Europe criticized the risk of tacitly accepting Putin's narrative and territorial demands, viewing Trump's shift in tone as granting Russia undue legitimacy. Broader insights from European statements. A coordinated coalition of the willing, including France, Germany, the UK, Italy, Poland, and EU Commission leadership, reiterated that peace cannot be negotiated without Ukraine and rejected any territorial concessions to Russia. Social media reactions were also strong. German diplomat Wolfgang Ischinger lamented, "Putin got his red carpet treatment with Trump, Trump got nothing. Clearly 1-0 for Putin. For the Ukrainians, nothing. For Europe, deeply disappointing." Lithuania's Defense Minister Dovilas Sakaliin denounced Putin's comments as gaslighting and veiled threats, noting that Russian attacks on civilians persisted throughout the summit. Statement by French President Emmanuel Macron, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, European Council President Antonio Costa, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Early this morning, President Trump debriefed us and President Zelensky following his meeting with the Russian president in Alaska on August 15, 2025. Leaders welcomed President Trump's efforts to stop the killing in Ukraine, end Russia's war of aggression, and achieve just and lasting peace. As President Trump said, "There's no deal until there's a deal." As envisioned by President Trump, the next step must now be further talks including President Zelensky, whom he will meet soon. We are also ready to work with President Trump and President Zelensky towards a trilateral summit with European support. We are clear that Ukraine must have ironclad security guarantees to effectively defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We welcome President Trump's statement that the U.S. is prepared to give security guarantees. The coalition of the willing is ready to play an active role. No limitations should be placed on Ukraine's armed forces or on its cooperation with third countries. Russia cannot have a veto against Ukraine's pathway to EU and NATO. It will be up to Ukraine to make decisions on its territory. International borders must not be changed by force. Our support to Ukraine will continue. We are determined to do more to keep Ukraine strong in order to achieve an end to the fighting and a just and lasting peace. As long as the killing in Ukraine continues, we stand ready to uphold the pressure on Russia. We will continue to strengthen sanctions and wider economic measures to put pressure on Russia's war economy until there is a just and lasting peace. Ukraine can count on our unwavering solidarity as we work towards a peace that safeguards Ukraine's and Europe's vital security interests. Reuters, August 16, 2025. Summary of key points. The European leaders welcomed President Trump's efforts to end violence and bring about a just and lasting peace. They emphasized the necessity of including President Zelensky in any further negotiations and called for a trilateral summit involving the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. Ironclad security guarantees for Ukraine are essential to uphold its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and ability to choose its alliances, including its path toward EU and NATO. Any imposed limitations on Ukraine's armed forces or external cooperation are unacceptable and Russia cannot veto Ukraine's pathway. Decisions concerning Ukrainian territory must be made by Ukraine itself, and international borders cannot be changed by force. Europe remains committed to its unwavering support for Ukraine, including maintaining and strengthening sanctions and economic pressure on Russia until peace is achieved.